Chapter 34 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 34. June is the month for the old world garden that holds mystery and fragrance within its red brick walls. In Lombard Street you would suspect no wealth of flowers, and yet in the passing through of one of those solid, mellow Georgian houses you might meet dreams from the bourne of a charmed sleep. Aloofness is the note of such a garden. It is no piece of pompous mosaic work spread before the front windows of a stockbroker's villa, a conventional colour scheme to impress the public. The true garden has no studied ostentation. It is a charm apart, a quiet corner of life smelling of lavender, built for old books, and memories that have the mystery of hills touched by the dawn. You will find the monk's hood growing in tall campaniles, ringing a note of blue, columbines, fountains of gold and red, great tumbling rose trees like the foam of the sea, stocks all abloom, pansies like antique enamel work, clove pinks breathing up incense to meet the wind-blown fragrance of elder trees in flower. You might hear birds singing as though in the wild deeps of a haunted wood, whose trees part the sunset into panels of living fire. Mary of the plain face and the loyal heart had opened the green front door to a big man, whose broad shoulders seemed fit to bear the troubles of the whole town. He had asked for Catherine and her husband. "They are in the garden, sir." "Alone?" "Yes, only Master Jack." Canon Stensley bowed his iron-grey head under the oriental curtain that screened the passage leading from the hall to the garden. "Thanks, I know the way." The rector of St. Antonius came out into the sunlight, and stood looking about him for an instant with the air of a man whose eyes were always open to what was admirable in life. A thrush had perched itself on the pinnacle of a yew, and was singing his vesper song, with the broad west for an altar of splendid gold. The chiming of the hour rang from St. Antonia's steeple, half hid by the green mist of its elms. A few trails of smoke rising from the red brick chimney-stacks alone betrayed the presence of a town. To an old college man such an evening brought back memories of sunny courts, cloisters, and sleek lawns, the ringing of bells towards sunset, the dark swirl of a river under the yawn of bridges that linked gardens to gardens beneath the benisons of mighty trees. Yet the light on Canon Stensley's face was not wholly a placid light. It was as though he came as a messenger from the restless, bickering outer world, a friend whom friendship freighted with words not easy to be said. A glimmer of white under an old cherry-tree showed where Catherine sat reading, with the boy Jack prone on the grass, the Swiss Family Robinson under his chin. Murchison was lying back in a deck-chair, watching the smoke from his pipe amid the foliage overhead. Master Jack, rolling from elbow to elbow, as he thrilled over the passage of the tub-boat from the wreck, caught sight of the Canon crossing the lawn. Catherine was warned by a tug at her skirts, and very audible stage aside. "Look out! Here's old Canon Stensley." "Shh, Jack." "Should like to see him afloat in a tub-boat. Take a big—" A tweak of the ear nipped the boy's reflection in the bud. His father gave him a significant push in the direction of the fruit garden. "See if there are any strawberries ripe." "I've looked twice, Dad." "Oh, no doubt. Go and look again." Canon Stensley's big fist had closed on Catherine's fingers. He was not the conventional figure, the portly, smiling cleric, the man of the world with a benignant yet self-sufficient air. Like many big men, silent and peculiarly sensitive, his quiet manner suggested a diffidence anomalous in a man of 6 feet 2. To correct the impression, one had but to look at the steady blue of the eye, the firm yet sympathetic mouth, the staunchness of the chin. It is a fallacy that lives perennially, the belief that a confident face, an aggressive manner, and much facility of speech necessarily mark the man of power. A courtly person would have remarked on the beauty of the evening, and discovered something in the garden to praise. Canon Stensley was not a man given to pleasant commonplaces. He said nothing, and sat down. Murchison handed him his cigar-case. "Thanks, not before dinner." His habit of silence, the silence of a man who spoke only when he had something definite to say, gave him, to strangers, an expression of reserve. Canon Stensley invariably made talkative men feel uncomfortable. It was otherwise with people who had learned to know the nature of his sincerity. "Hullo, what literature have we here?" He picked up Jack's discarded book, and turned over the pages as though the illustrations brought back recollections of his own youth. As a boy he had been the most irrepressible young mischief-monger, a youngster whom Elisha would have bequeathed to the bear's claws. "Ever a member of the Robinson family, Mrs. Murchison?" Catherine caught a suspicious side-glint in his eye. "I suppose all children read the book." "I wonder how much of the moralizing you remember." "Very little, I'm afraid." "Nor do I. Children demand life, not moralizing upon life." And the canon scrutinized a picture portraying the harpooning of a turtle, as though he had gloated over that picture many times as a boy. Catherine had caught the glimpse of Mary's white apron signalling for help in some domestic problem. She was glad of the excuse to leave the two men together. The sense of a woman is never more in evidence than when she surrenders her husband to a friend. "Can you spare me half an hour for a talk?" "I am not overburdened with work yet." "Oh, it will come." He turned over the pages deliberately, glancing at each picture. "Your wife looks well." "Yes, in spite of everything." "A matter of heart and pluck." "She has the courage of Cordelia." Canon Stensley put the book down upon the grass. The two men were silent a while, Murchison lying back in his chair, smoking, the churchman leaning forward a little, with arms folded, his massive face set rather sternly in the repose of thought. "There is something I want to talk to you about." Murchison turned his head, but did not move his body. "Yes?" "Don't set me down as a busybody. I think I have a duty to you as a friend. It is a matter of justice." The canon's virtues were of the practical workmanlike order. He was not an eloquent man in the oratorical sense, having far too straightforward and sincere a personality to wax hysterical for the benefit of a church full of women. But he was a man who was listened to by men. Murchison turned half restlessly in his chair. "With reference to the old scandal?" he asked. "Yes." "Something unpleasant, of course. Things that are put about behind one's back are generally unpleasant. It was my wife who discovered the report. Women hear more lies than we do, you know." "As a rule." "I decided that it was only fair that you should know, since slandered people are generally the last to hear of their own invented sins." "Thanks, I appreciate honesty." Canon Stensley sat motionless a moment, staring at the house. Then he rose up leisurely from his chair, reached for one of the branches of the cherry tree, drew it down, and examined the forming fruit. "They say that you used to drink." Murchison remained like an Egyptian Memnon looking towards Thebes. The churchman talked on. "I have heard the same thing said about one or two of my dearest friends. Vile exaggeration of some explainable incident. The report originated from a certain lady who resides over against my church. Her husband is a professional man." He pulled down a second bough, and brushed the young fruit with his fingers to see whether it was set or not. The silence had something of the tension of expense. Murchison knew that his old friend was waiting for a denial. "That's quite true. I drank at one time." A man of less ballast and less unselfishness would have rounded on the speaker, perhaps with an affected incredulity that would have embittered the consciousness of the confession. Canon Stensley did nothing so insignificant. He let the branch of the cherry tree slip slowly through his fingers, put his hands in his pockets, and walked aside 3 paces, as though to examine the tree at another angle. "Tell me about it." There was a pause of a few seconds. My father drank. Poor old Dad. I'm not trying to shelve the affair by putting it on his shoulders. My father and my grandfather both died of drink. My wife knows. She did not know when we were married. That was wrong. If ever a man owed anything to the love of a good woman, I am that man." Canon Stensley returned to his chair. His face bore the impress of deep thought. He had the air of a man ready to help in the bearing of a brother's burden, not with any bombast and display, but as though it were as natural an action as holding out a hand. "It can't have been very serious," he said. Murchison set his teeth. "A sort of hell while it lasted, a tempting of the devil. Not often, perhaps the worse for that." "Ah, I can understand." "It was when I was overworked." "Jaded." "The wife was something better than a ministering angel. She was a brave woman. She fought for me. We should have won, without that scandal, but for a mad piece of folly I took to be heroism." The churchman extended a large hand. "I'll smoke after all," he said. "Do." Murchison opened his cigar case. Canon Stensley was as deliberate a man wholly at his ease. There was not a tremor as he held the lighted match. "Do you know, Murchison, I appreciate this deeply." He returned the matchbox. "It puts you in a new light to me, a finer light, with that rare wife of yours." Murchison was refilling his pipe, lines of thought crossing his forehead. "When my child died—" "Yes?" "I seemed to lose part of myself. I had crushed the curse then. I don't know how to explain the psychology of the affair, but when she died, the other thing died also." Canon Stensley nodded. "It was what we call dipsomania. I never touched alcohol for years. I had been a fool as a student. At my worst, I only had the crave now and again." "And you are sure?" "Sure that that curse killed my child, indirectly. Is it strange that her death should have killed the curse?" "As I trust in God, no." The thrush was singing again on the yew tree, another thrush answering it from a distant garden. Canon Stensley lay back in his chair and smiled. "Stay here," he said quietly. "In Roxton?" "Yes. You have friends. Trust them. There is a greater sense of justice in this world than most cynics allow. I never knew man fight a good fight, a clean uphill fight, and lose in the end." They were smoking peacefully under the cherry tree when Catherine returned. She had no suspicion of what had passed, for no storm spirit had left its torn clouds in the summer air. Her husband's face was peculiarly calm and placid. "Where's that boy of yours, Mrs. Murchison?" "Jack?" "Yes. He was hunting the strawberry beds half an hour ago." "Tell him," and the canon chuckled, "tell him I am not too big yet for a tub." "Oh, Canon Stensley!" "My dear Mrs. Murchison, I said many a truer thing when I was a boy. Children strike home. To have his vanity chastened, let a man listen to children." The big man with the massive head and the broad British chest had gone. Husband and wife were sitting alone under the cherry tree. "You told him all?" "All, Kate." "And it was Betty? That woman! May she never have to bear what we have borne." Murchison was sitting with his elbows on his knees, his chin upon his fists. "Well, they know the worst, at last," he said grimly. "We can clear for action. That's a grand man, Kate. I shall stay and fight as he would were he in my place." She stretched out a hand and let it rest upon his shoulder. "You are what I would have you be, brave. Our chance will come." "God grant it." "You shall show these people what manner of man you are." End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. Chapter 35. Dr. Little descended the stairs of Major Murray's house with the alert and rather furtive look of a man who has been for days subjected to the semi-sceptical questions of interested relatives. Parker Steele had attended at the introduction of a third Miss Murray into the world. The whole affair had seemed but the ordinary yearly incident of the great, rambling, florid-faced house, whose windows appeared to have copied its owner's military stare. It was during Dr. Little's regency that Major Murray's wife had developed certain sinister symptoms that had worried the locum tenens very seriously. Concern for his own self-conceit, rather than concern for the patient, characterized Dr. Little's attitude towards the case. The professional spirit, when cultivated to the uttermost end of complexity, becomes an impersonation of the intellectual ego. A thin, acute-faced woman with sandy hair appeared at the dining-room door as Dr. Little reached the hall. This lady with the sandy hair and freckles happened to be the most inquisitive, suspicious, and irrebuffable of sisters that Dr. Little had ever encountered on guard over her brother's domestic happiness. "Good morning." "Damn the woman. Good morning." Miss Murray's attitude betrayed the inevitable catechization. Dr. Little followed her into the dining-room. "And how do you find my sister-in-law this morning, Dr. Little?" Miss Murray had an aggressive, expeditious manner that disorganized any ordinary mortal's sense of self-sufficiency and vain repose. In action her hair seemed to become sandier in color, her freckles more yellow and independent. In speech she reminded the locum tenens of a quick-firing gun whose exasperating detonations numbered so many snaps a minute. "Mrs. Murray is no worse this morning. In fact, I can—" "The temperature?" "The temperature is a little above normal." Dr. Little's distinguished air became 10 times more distinguished. He articulated in his throat, and began to pull on his gloves with gestures of great finality. "Did you notice that reddish rash?" "It is our duty, Miss Murray, to notice such things." "And the throat? It seems very red and angry." "A certain degree of pharyngitis is present." "Well, and what's the meaning of it all, Dr. Little?" "Meaning, Miss Murray? Really?" "There's a cause for everything, I imagine." "Certainly. The problem—" "You admit, then, that there is something problematic in the case, Dr. Little?" "There is a problem in every—" "Of course. But in my sister-in-law's case, that is the matter under discussion." "Pardon me, madam. It is impossible to discuss certain—" "My brother desires something definite. He was obliged to go to town to-day." "I should prefer to give my opinion. Major Murray left instructions that I should wire to his club—" "His club?" "Whether any definite conclusion had been arrived at." The two disputants had been volleying and counter-volleying at point-blank range. Neither displayed any sign of giving ground or of surrender. The Scotch lady's voice had harshened into a slight rasp of natural Gaelic. Dr. Little still fumbled at the buttons of his gloves, his words very much in his throat, his whole pose characteristic of the profession upon its dignity. "It is quite impossible, Miss Murray, for me to discuss this case." The thin lady's pupils were no bigger than pinheads, so that her eyes looked like 2 circles of hard, blue glass. "Very well, Dr. Little, I must telegraph to my brother that no conclusion has been reached." "Pardon me, that would be indiscreet." "To provide me with a solution." The distinguished gentleman had completed the buttoning of his gloves. "I shall hope to see Major Murray in person to-morrow." "You shall see him, Dr. Little, without fail." The locum tenens conducted a dignified retreat, fully aware of the fact that the sandy-haired lady believed him to be an ignoramus. "Confound the woman! How can I tell her what I think?" he reflected. "It seems to me that there is half a ton of domestic dynamite waiting to be exploded in that house. I hardly relish the responsibility. If matters don't clear in a day or two, I shall wire for Steele. It is his case, not mine." To a much hustled man, whose temper had been chastened by a series of irritating incidents, the picture of a pretty woman smiling up at him from a neat luncheon-table revivified the more sensuous satisfactions of existence. Men who live to eat, smoke, and enjoy the curves of a woman's figure are in the main very docile mortals. The savour of a well-cooked entree will dispel despair and bring down heaven. Dr. Little sat down with a grieved sigh, unfolded his napkin, and accepted Miss Ellison's sympathy as though it were his just and sovereign due. He still had a vision of freckles and sandy hair, and echoes of an aggressive voice that revived memories of the dame school he had attended when in frocks. "What a morning you must have had! It is nearly 2." "A delightful morning, I can assure you. Excuse me, Miss Ellison, the cover of that magazine you have been reading reminds me of a certain female's hair. Would you mind removing it from sight?" "Is the memory so poignant?" "Poignant? And she has freckles the size of peas. Ugh! I wonder why it is that one's patients always seem to conspire against one by being mulish and irritating all on the same day." "Something in the air, perhaps, poor man." "Poor man it is, I assure you, when you have had a series of cantankerous old ladies to blarney. I wonder if I might have a glass of sherry. Oh, don't bother, let me get it." As though the mere offer absolved him from all further effort, Dr. Little sat still and fed, while Madge Ellison rummaged in the sideboard for the decanter. "How much, a tumblerful?" She bent over him as she poured out the wine, the gold chain she wore dangling against his cheek. "Thanks, 3 fingers. How angelic a thing is woman!" "Even when she has freckles and straw-colored hair?" "Forbear, forbear. Ah, now I began to revive a little." He drank the wine, wiped his moustache, and leaned back in his chair, as though to reflect on the natural philosophy of life. Madge Ellison entered into the system as a pleasing and satisfactory protoplasmic development. To this bachelor, who already showed a tendency to plumpness below the heart, she was bracketed with good wine, 9-penny cigars, and well-cooked dishes, a thing pleasant to look at, and pleasant, perhaps, to taste. "How is Mrs. Steele?" Cutlets and new peas were pushed aside. Dr. Little helped himself generously to sponge custard, his eyes fixed affectionately upon the dish. "I am rather worried about Betty." "Worried?" The bachelor began to look sleek and happy. His outlook upon life changed greatly after a few magical passes with a spoon and fork. "I wish you would go up and see her after lunch." "Anything to oblige a lady who can show no freckles. What is the woe? A cold in the head?" Madge Ellison had returned to her chair, and was rocking it gracefully to and fro on 2 legs. She might have posed as a living metronome, marking the rhythm for the epicure's busy spoon. "How frivolous you doctors are!" Dr. Little wiped a streak of custard from his moustache with his dinner napkin. "It is my hour of relaxation. Haven't you heard the tale of the 2 bishops who played leap-frog at the end of a church conference? But, to be serious, what are the symptoms?" "She seems rather feverish, and has a sore throat. I noticed something that looked like herpes on her lip." "Herpes, eh? Will she let me see her?" "I'll run up and ask." "Thanks. Is the paper reposing anywhere?" "Oh, don't bother. On the window sill? Thanks. Much obliged." And he propped the paper against the decanter, and so consoled himself with the happy facility of a bachelor. Betty Steele, in a richly laced dressing-jacket, was sitting up in bed with Persian mignon in her lap. "Bring the man up, dear, if it will give you any satisfaction. Any news in the town?" Madge Ellison sat down and chatted for 5 minutes, while the cat purred under Betty's hand. "I saw Kate Murchison in Castle Gate this morning." "Alone?" "No, being convoyed by the canoness." Betty Steele's mouth curved into a sneer. "A most respectable connection. Did you see any blue ribbon about?" "You are rather hard on the poor wretches, Betty." Am I?" And she gave a short, sharp laugh. "Every woman sides with her husband, I suppose. You might rub some scent on my forehead, dear." Dr. Little finished a cigar, and yawned in turn over every page of the paper before ascending to Mrs. Betty's room. Madge Ellison opened the door to him. His shoulder brushed her arm as he entered, quite the professional agag where the patient was a woman and under 50. Dr. Little remained some 15 minutes beside Mrs. Betty's bed. His air of lazy refinement left him by degrees, giving place to the interested and puzzled alertness of the physician. It was the curious nodular swelling on Parker Steel's wife's lip that led him to discover glandular enlargement under her round, white chin. "Hair falling out at all?" he asked casually. "Why refer to a woman's one eternal woe?" "Oh, nothing," and he smiled a little stiffly. "The throat is sore, is it not?" "Yes." "Turn to the light, please. Open the mouth wide and say, 'Ah.'" Yes, rather inflamed." And Dr. Little, after moving his head from side to side, like a man peering down the bowl of a pipe, drew back from the bed, his eyes fixed momentarily on Betty Steele's face with peculiarly intent stare. "I'll send you up a gargle for the throat." "Thanks. I shall be all right for Saturday, I suppose." "I hope so." "It is the last rehearsal. I must not miss it." "Have you heard from Dr. Steele to-day?" Betty was holding Mignon's head between her two hands, and looking into the cat's yellow eyes. Something in the intonation of Dr. Little's voice seemed to startle her. She glanced up at him with a questioning smile. "I expect him back in a week or so. Madge, get me that letter, dear. I think he said next Wednesday. Is there anything—" Little had moved towards the door. "I only wanted to know the date. I promised some months ago to do some locum work for an old friend this week." Betty had glanced through her husband's letter. She laid it aside when Dr. Little had gone, and took Mignon back into her lap. "That man's worried about something, Madge," she said. "Worried? Not a bit of it, dear." "Why not?" "It's not in the bachelor nature to worry, provided food is plentiful and work slack. Pins wouldn't prick him. They're selfish beasts." "I thought you liked the man, Madge." "The men we flirt with, dear, are not often the men we marry." Meanwhile, Dr. Little had descended the stairs, looking as serious as any middle-aged demigod who had been snubbed by a schoolgirl. He crossed the hall to Parker Steele's consulting room, took out a bottle containing tabloids of perchloride of mercury from the cabinet, dissolved 2 in the basin fixed in one corner of the room, and sedulously and carefully disinfected his hands. "How the devil—" This meditative exclamation appeared to limit the gentleman's reflections for the moment. He stood with bent shoulders, staring at his hands soaking in the rose-tinted water, like some medieval wiseacre striving to foresee the future in a pot of ink. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. The glitter of the sea visible between the foliage of flowering shrubs seemed to add a touch of vivacity to the June somnolence that hung like a summer mist over the south coast town. Parker Steel, half lying in a basket chair under a red may tree in the hotel garden, betrayed his sympathy with the poetical paraphernalia of life by reading through a list of investments recommended by his brokers. A satisfactory breakfast, followed by the contemplation of a satisfactory banking account, begets peace in the heart of man. It was about 10 o'clock, and a few enthusiasts were already quarrelling over croquet, when the hotel buttons came out with a telegram on a tray. "Number 25, Dr. Steele?" "Here." "Any reply, sir?" The boy waited, with the tray held over that portion of his figure where his morning meal reposed, while Parker Steel tore open the envelope and read the message. "No answer." "Right, sir. Wait. Tell them at the office to get my bill made up. I have to leave after lunch." "Yes, sir." And bring me a timetable and a whiskey and soda." Parker Steele glanced at his watch, thrust the investment list into the breast pocket of his coat, and lay back again in his chair, with the telegram across his knee. Faces vary much in their expression when the mind behind the face labours with some thought that fills the whole consciousness for the moment. The smooth indolence had melted from the physician's features. His face had sharpened, as faces sharpen in bitter weather, for a man who is a coward betrays his cowardice even when he thinks. A much-grieved croquet-player, in a blue and white check dress, was confiding her criticisms to a very sympathetic gentleman in one corner of the lawn. "It is such a pity that Mrs. Sallow cheats so abominably. I hate playing with mean people. Every other stroke is a spoon, and she is always walking over her ball, and shifting it with her skirt when it is wired. People give their characters away in games. It is so contemptible. I can't understand any self-respecting person cheating." The continuous click of the balls appeared to irritate Parker Steele, as he sat huddled up in his chair with the telegram on his knee. He found himself listening, without curiosity, to the young lady in the blue and white, whose complaints suggested that the immoral Mrs. Sallow was the cleverer player of the two. Dishonesty is only dishonest, to many people, when it comes within the cognizance of the law, and how thoroughly symbolical those 4 balls were of the opportunities mortals manipulate in life, Parker Steele might have realized, had not his mind been clogged with other things. The boy returned with a timetable and the whiskey and soda on a tray. "A fast train leaves at 2:30, sir." "Thanks. Get me a table. You can keep the change." "Much obliged, sir," and he touched a carefully watered forelock. "Will you drive, sir, or walk?" "Order me a cab." "Right, sir." And the boy noticed, as he turned away, that the hand shook that reached for the glass, and that some of the stuff was spilled before it came to the man's lips. No one met Parker Steele at Roxton Station that June evening. A porter piled his luggage on a cab, for the physician's own carriage was not forthcoming. A sense of isolation and neglect took hold upon him as he drove through the sleepy streets of the old town. Loneliness is never comforting to a man who is cursed with an irrepressible conscience, and his own restless imaginings rose like a cold fog into the June air. Parker Steele shivered as he had often shivered when driving through moonlit mists to answer a midnight message. The very elms about St. Antonia's spire had a shadowy strangeness for him, a gloom that gave nothing of the glow of a return home. Parker Steele stood in his own dining-room, waiting and listening, as though he were in a stranger's house. Simons, the starched servant, had opened the door to him without a smile. His luggage had been carried upstairs. He had heard voices, faint, distant voices, that had tantalized him with words that he could not understand. He had been ready to ask the woman Simons a dozen questions, but had faltered from a self-conscious fear of betraying his own thoughts. The house seemed full of some indefinable dread as the dusk deepened towards night. A door opened above. He heard footsteps descending the stairs, so slowly in the silence of the darkening house that the sound reminded the man of the slow drip of water into a well. Parker Steele found himself counting them as they descended towards the hall. If it was Betty, how was he to construe the message of the morning? The suffering of suspense drove him to action. He turned sharply, crossed the room, and opening the door, looked out into the hall. "Hello, dear, is it you?" She was in white, and her foot was on the last step of the stairs. "I am glad you have come, Parker. I had your wire early. I imagined—" "That I was ill?" "Yes, that you were ill." She halted with one hand on the carved foot-post of the balustrading. The dusk of the hall showed nothing but a white figure and a grey oval to mark her face. Some mysterious psychic force seemed to hold husband and wife apart. Their two personalities had become incompatible through some subtle ferment of distrust. "Parker!" He made a step forward. "No, I want you to go into that room and light the gas." The insistent note in her voice repulsed him. His walk approached a self-conscious shuffle as he turned and re-entered the darkening room. Betty heard him groping for the matches. A sudden glare of light followed the sharp purr of a flaring match. She drew a deep and sighing breath, pressed her hands to her breast, and entered the room. Parker Steele was drawing the blinds. His wife closed the door and waited for him to turn. "When I had your wire, dear—" "Yes?" "I wondered what I should find here. The wording. Good heavens, Betty!" She stood back from him and leaned against the sideboard, the glare from the gas falling full upon her face. It was red, repulsive, tinged with ooze that had hardened here and there into yellow scabs. "You see, Parker, why I sent for you." He looked for the moment like a man shocked into immobility by a sudden storm of wind and sleet beating on his face. "When did this appear?" He moved towards her, the shallow gleam of sympathy in his eyes darkened by something more terrible than mere fear. Betty stood her ground. It was the man who betrayed the incoherency of panic. "Come, tell me." His eyes were fixed upon her face, upon her mouth. "It is I, Parker, who want to know." "Yes, yes, of course, dear. I can understand. You should have sent for me sooner." Intuition is a gift of the gods to women, a power, almost unholy in its brilliant reading of the hearts of others. Betty's eyes were searching her husband's face as though it were some delicately finished miniature in which every piece of shading had significance. Her breath came and went more deeply than when life had a normal flow. For all else, she was cold, very quiet, the mistress even of her own repulsive face. "I want you to tell me, Parker." She saw the muscles about his mouth quiver. "Have you seen anyone?" "Yes." "Who?" "Dr. Little and Dr. Brimley." "Well?" "What?" "They would tell me nothing." "Nothing?" She saw him breathe out deeply like a man who has seen a child escape the wheels of a heavy cart. "They gave me mere phrases, Parker. A woman can tell when men are hiding the truth." "What had they to hide, dear? Come closer, here, to the light." She did not stir. "I must know, Parker." "Yes, of course." "The whole truth. Listen. I happened to go yesterday morning into your consulting room. Dr. Little had been reading. He had left the book open at a certain page. You know, Parker, that many men only read the big textbooks when they are puzzled by a particular case." Steele's face seemed nothing but a grey and frightened mask to her. "Betty, you are imagining things." "Well, tell me the truth." "A form of eczema." "Parker!" Her voice had the ring of iron in it. "That was not the word I read." "Good God, Betty!" "It was this." She spoke the word without flinching, with a distinctness that had the cold and terrible conciseness that science loves. Her eyes did not leave her husband's face. Even as he answered her, hotly, haltingly, she knew him to be a liar. "Impossible! You are seizing on a mad coincidence, a mere ridiculous conclusion. I can swear—" "Yes, swear." "That it is nothing, nothing of what you have said." His eyes had the furtive fierceness of eyes searching her soul for unbelief. "Come, Betty, wife." She remained unmoved. "What, you think that I—" "No, don't touch me. I don't believe that you have told me the truth." "Not believe that I—" "No, God help me, I cannot." Her body had hardly changed the pose that it had taken from the first moment. It was as though it had stiffened with the slow, pitiless hardening of her heart. Parker Steele looked at her like the moral coward that he was, too crushed by his own consciousness of shame to pretend to the courage that he could not boast. "Betty, am I—" She flung aside from him with an indescribable gesture of passionate repulsion. "Don't! I can't look at you, or be looked at. Madge is waiting for me. They will bring you your dinner. Good night." She moved towards the door. "Betty!" he would have hindered her, but the manhood in him had neither the power nor the pride. She swept out and left him. He heard the sound of sobbing as she climbed the stairs. Good God! Parker Steel stood listening, staring at the door. A man who could neither think nor act. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of A Woman Swore by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. On 2 successive days, the society of loafers that lounged outside the gates of Roxton Station for the ostensible purpose of carrying handbags and parcels had noticed Major Murray's red-wheeled dog-cart meet the afternoon express from town. The society of luggage loafers boasted a membership of 4. It was not an energetic brotherhood, and had put up a living protest against the unseemly scurry and bustle of 20th century methods. The society's loafing ground ran along the white fence that closed in the goods yard, a fence that carried, from 4 distinct patches of discoloration, the marks left by the brothers' bodies in their postures of dignified and independent ease. All the comings and goings of Roxton seemed known to these 4 gentlemen, whose eyes were ever on the alert, though their hands remained in their trousers pockets. A fly basking on the sidewalk within 6 feet would be seen and dislodged by a brisk discharge of saliva from between one of the members' lips. Like Diogenes, they had reduced impertinence to a fine art, and the major portion of the society's funds was patriotically disbursed to swell the state's revenue on beer. Psst! Here he is again. Who? A mouth was wiped by the back of a hand. Murray's man. Same un? Yes. Little fellow with the twirly moustache. What d'ye guess he be, Jack? Looks as though he might have come twine the clocks. You bet. To do with the babies, I've heard. Ah, how's that then? Murray's man, he told me t'other evening. This little fella be what they call a Lunnon special. Dunno what edition. 3 pairs of eyes, one member was absent on duty at the pub, followed Major Murray's dog-cart with an all-engrossing stare as its red wheels whirled by in the June sunshine. Thought Steele had the managing of all Murray's badgers. So he has. Didn't you see him come back by the 7:50 t'other day? I did. And the other feller who's been wearing Steele's breeches all the month went off by the 4:49. He did. Saucy-looking chap. Gimme Jim Murchison and blow the liquor. He tells you what's what, and no mistake. Said I should drink myself to death, and so I shall. What, had the raps again, Frank? Yes, all along with me old liver. Chucks it out of me every morning, reg'lar as clockwork. The observations of the brotherhood were reliable as far as the identity of the gentleman in Major Murray's dog-cart was concerned. He was named Dr. Peterson, and his caliber may be appreciated by the fact that he received a cheque for 25 guineas when he travelled 40 miles to and fro from his house in Mayfair. Moreover, he had left his card the preceding day on Dr. Parker Steel, with a note urging that an interview between them was urgent and inevitable. Parker Steel's face had betrayed exceeding discomfort and alarm on reading the name on the piece of pasteboard that Dr. Peterson had left on the general practitioner's hall table. It was about 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Thursday when Major Murray's dog-cart clattered over the cobbles of St. Antonia's Square, and deposited a very spruce little man in a well-cut frock-coat and a blemishless tall hat at Parker Steel's door. The imperturbable Simons recognized him as the caller of yesterday. "Dr. Steele's out, sir." "Out? Very sorry, sir. You gave him my card and note?" "Certainly, sir. Will you wait? Dr. Steele should be back at any minute." Dr. Peterson glanced at his watch and stepped like a dapper little bantam into the hall. His reddish hair was plastered from a broad pathway in the middle, so as to conceal the premature tendency to baldness that his pate betrayed. Dr. Peterson's figure boasted a juvenile waist. His face, smooth and very sleek, almost suggested the craft of the beauty specialist. A red and green bandana handkerchief protruded from his breast coat pocket, an aesthetic patch of colour harmonizing with his sage-green tie. He wore black and white check trousers, patent leather boots, and a tuberose in his buttonhole. Moreover, his person smelled fragrantly of scent. Dr. Peterson deposited his hat and gloves on the hall table. "I can spare half an hour. My train goes at 5. It is highly important that I should see Dr. Steele." "I will tell him, sir, the minute he returns." And she showed Dr. Peterson into the drawing-room. A bedroom bell rang as Simons was descending the stairs to the kitchen. She turned with a "Drat the thing!" and dawdled heavenward to her mistress's room. "Who has called, Simons?" "Dr. Peterson, ma'am." "From Major Murray's?" "Yes, ma'am. Wants to see the master, most particular." "Dr. Steele's not in?" "No, ma'am, but he left word that he would be at home about 4. "Thanks, Simons, you can go." The servant's ill-conditioned stare was bitterness to a woman of Betty's pride and penetration. The finer touches of courtesy, the more delicate instincts, are rarely developed in the lower classes. Even the starched Simons is utterly cow-like in her manners. Betty felt her face sore under the servant's eyes. A big red book lay open upon the dressing-table amid Betty Steele's crowd of silver knick-knacks. It was the medical dictionary, and lay open at the London list and at the letter P. Dr. Peterson's name headed the left-hand page, as staff physician to sundry hospitals and charitable institutions, and as a holder of medals, diplomas, and degrees galore. A cursory glance at the titles of his contributions to medical literature would have marked him out as one of the leading authorities on diseases of the skin. Betty Steele looked in her pier-glass, fluffed out her hair a little, and fastening the scarf of her green tea-gown, crossed the landing towards the stairs. She had that steady and almost staring expression of the eyes that betrays a purpose suddenly but seriously matured. She had not spoken with her husband since their meeting on the night of his return. "Dr. Peterson, I believe." The specialist had been reviewing the photographs on the mantelpiece, and had displayed his good taste by electing a handsome cousin of Betty's as his ideal for the moment. He set the silver frame down rather hurriedly, and turned at the sound of the door opening, a dapper, diplomatic, yet rather finicking figure, the figure more of a little man about town than of a brilliant and prosperous London consultant. "Mrs. Steele?" He had glanced up with a slight puckering of the brows into Betty's face. "Yes, I'm sorry my husband is out. I have taken the opportunity, Dr. Peterson, of consulting you." She moved towards the window, graceful, well-poised, and unembarrassed. The specialist stood aside, his face a sympathetic blank, a bird-like and inquisitive alertness visible in his eyes. "You have noticed my face, Dr. Peterson." She stood before him unflinchingly, a woman of distinction and of charm of manner despite her great disfigurement. The fingers of Dr. Peterson's right hand were fidgeting with his watch-chain. It was wholly improper for a London consultant to appear embarrassed. "You wish to consult me?" "Yes." He hesitated, elevated his eyebrows, and then met her with a conciliatory smile. "I do not know, Mrs. Steele, whether—" She understood his meaning and the significance of his hesitation. "My husband—yes, your opinion will be of interest to him. Let us be frank." Dr. Peterson advanced one patent leather boot, put the forefinger of his right hand under Betty's chin, and turned her face towards the light. She could see that he was profoundly interested, despite his air of shallow smartness; also that he was somewhat perplexed by the responsibility she had thrust upon him. How long have you noticed the swelling on the lip?" "5 weeks or more. Perhaps longer." "The throat?" She opened her mouth wide. Dr. Peterson peered into it and frowned. "The rash has been present some days?" "Yes." "You are paler than usual?" "I think so." "Feverish?" "A little." "Of course, Dr. Steele has seen all this?" "Yes." "He was embarrassed, troubled, and betrayed the feeling in an increased fussiness and polite magniloquence of manner. "You must pardon me, Mrs. Steele." "I want you to be quite frank with me. I am ready to answer any questions. You may think my attitude unusual—" "Not at all, not at all," and he flicked his handkerchief from his pocket, and began to polish a lens in a tortoise-shell setting. "I must confess, Dr. Peterson, that I have been subjected to a great deal of worry and doubt. My husband only returned yesterday. Of course, you know about that. Dr. Little sent for you to see Major Murray's wife, I believe." Dr. Peterson still flourished his handkerchief. "Has Dr. Steele expressed any opinion to you?" "About this?" "Yes." "He told me that it was a form of eczema." The specialist threw a sharp, penetrating look at her face. "That was your husband's diagnosis?" "I believe it to be incorrect." "Indeed." "And that he knows that he has not told me the truth." Both heard the rattle of a latch-key in the lock of the front door, and the sound of footsteps in the hall. Symonds could be heard hurrying up the stairs from the kitchen. She spoke to someone in the hall, a tired and toneless voice answering her in curt monosyllables. It was Parker Steel. Dr. Peterson walked up the room and back again to the window, glancing rather nervously at the clock as he passed. His attitude was that of a man who has been entangled in the meshes of a very delicate dilemma, and he was waiting to see how Betty Steele's mood shaped. She was standing with one hand resting on the back of a chair, as though steadying herself for the inevitable crisis. "Ah, good day, I must apologize. Betty!" He had entered with an elaborate flourish intended to suggest the brisk candor of a man much hurried in the public service. His wife's figure, outlined against the window, brought him to a dead halt on the threshold. The blood seemed to recede from his face in an instant. The alert, confident manner became a tense effort towards naturalness and self-control. "You will excuse us, Betty. Dr. Peterson and I have matters to discuss." He held the door open for her, but she did not budge. "I am consulting Dr. Peterson, Parker." Her husband's face seemed to grow thin and haggard, with the lights and shadows of the hall for the checkered background. The specialist stood jerking his watch-chain up and down. "I think—" he began. Betty turned to him with the air of a mistress of a salon. "This is a family affair, Dr. Peterson, is it not? There are no secrets that a husband and wife cannot share. I may tell my husband what I believe your opinion to be." "My opinion, madam?" His voice betrayed the rising impatience of a man irritated by finding his discretion taxed beyond its strength. The grim touch of the tragic element banished the veneer of formalism from his face. To pose such a man as Dr. Peterson with a problem in ethics engendered anger and impatience. "I am not aware that I have pledged myself to any expression of opinion." "No," and she smiled, "but I can ask you a blunt question, to which yes or no will be inevitable." The specialist met her eyes, and realized that the subtlety of a woman may make a man's prudence seem ridiculous. He was a rapid thinker, and the complexities of the situation began to shape themselves in his mind. Betty Steele was not a woman whom he would care to hinder with a lie. "You put me in a most embarrassing position." "Believe me, no." "With regard to another case I have some authority to speak." "Consider my case within your jurisdiction." "Betty!" Her husband's face was turned to hers in miserable reproof. "Remember, we are something to each other. I cannot bear—" He faltered as he read the unalterable purpose in her eyes. It is the nature of some women to appear incapable of pity when their self-love has received a poignant shock. "Then, Parker, you admit—" "For God's sake, Betty, let me have 5 minutes' privacy." She looked at him calmly, as though considering his inmost thoughts. "I think Dr. Peterson can deal with you more forcibly than I can. Is it sufficient that we understand each other?" "Have you no consideration for my self-respect?" "It is my self-respect that accuses you in this." And she turned and left the two men together. of Chapter 37. Chapter 38 of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 38. It was a wet evening in June, and a steady downrush of rain purred the tiled floors of the old town, and set the broad eaves and high-peaked gables dripping. A summer sweetness breathed in the gardens, where the fallen petals of rhododendrons lay like flame upon the green grass. The roses were weighed down with dew, and each leaf diamonded with a glimmering tear. In Lombard Street the tall cypresses stood like solemn monks cowled and coped against the rain. The downpour had lessened a little, and Jack Murchison flattened his nose against the nursery window, saw a country cart driven by a man in a white mackintosh swing into Lombard Street from the silver, rain-drenched sheen of St. Antonia's trees. The man's big white body streamed with wet, his face shining out like a drenched peony under the brim of his hat, that dripped like the flooded gutter of a house. Tremulous raindrops fell rhythmically from the big man's nose, and the apron that covered his legs was full of puddles. The country cart drew up outside the doctor's house, and Master Jack saw the big man in the white mackintosh climb out laboriously, the cart tilting under his weight. He threw the leather apron over the horse's loins, and swung the water out of his hat, disclosing to the boy above a round, bald patch about the size of a saucer. The bell rang, a good, rattling, honest peal that told of a straightforward and unaffected fist. Jack heard Mary's rather nasal treble answering the big man's vigorous bass. The white mackintosh was doffed and hung considerately on the handle of the bell. There was much wiping of boots while the man Gage appeared at the side gate in the garden wall, and came forward to hold the farmer's horse. "Sorry to bother you, doctor, on such a beast of an evening." "Come in, Mr. Carrington." "You remember me, sir?" "I don't forget many faces. Come into my study." The doffing of the white mackintosh had uncovered a robust and rather corpulent, thick-set figure in rough tweed jacket and breeches and box-cloth leggings. The farmer had one of those typically solid English faces, fresh-coloured though deeply wrinkled, and chastening its good humour with an alert, world-wise watchfulness in the rather deep-set eyes. Mr. Carrington was considered rather a masterful man by his friends, a man who could laugh while his wits were at work bettering a bargain. He was one of the most prominent farmers in the neighbourhood, and one of the few who confessed to making money despite the times. "My trap's waiting outside, doctor. I want you to come back with me right away to Goldspur Farm." Mr. Carrington was sitting on the extreme edge of a chair, and wiping the rain from his face with a silk handkerchief. "Anything much the matter?" "Well, doctor, you know I have taken to growing a lot of ground fruit, and I've had about 50 pickers down from town this year." Murchison nodded. "They've camped out in 2 tin shanties and a couple of tents down at Goldspur Farm. East Enders, all of them. And you never quite know, doctor, what an East Ender carries. Well, to be frank, I'm worried about some of 'em." Mr. Carrington sat squarely in his chair, and tapped the floor with the soles of his boots. He looked thoughtful, and the corners of his big, good-tempered mouth had a melancholy droop. "There's one woman in particular, doctor, and her youngster, who seem bad, sick and sweating, won't take food, they just lie there in the straw like logs. My foreman didn't tell me anything about it till this afternoon, but when I'd seen the woman I had the horse put in and came straight here." Murchison glanced at his watch, and then crossed the room and rang the bell. "Can you have me driven back?" he asked. "Certainly, doctor." "Good. Mary, will you ask your mistress to have dinner postponed till 8, and tell Gage to take these letters to the post. Now, Mr. Carrington, my mackintosh and I are at your service." "You'll need it, doctor, and an old hat." A slender vein of gold gashed the dull west as they left the outskirts of the town behind. As the rent in the sky broadened, long rays of light came down the valley, making the woods and meadows a glory of shimmering green, and firing the rain pools so that they shone like brass. The farmer took the private road that ran through Ulverston Park, a rolling wilderness of beeches and Scotch firs, whose green rides plunged into the glimmering rain-splashed umbrage of tall trees. Here were tangled banks of purpling heather, and great stretches of sweet woodland turf. Old yews brooded in the deeps of the domain, solemn and still, most ancient and wise of trees. "Get up, Molly," and Mr. Carrington shook a raindrop from his nose, and flicked the brown mare with the whip. "Clearing a little. Sorry for the people who cut their hay yesterday." "Somewhat damp. How's the fruit doing?" "Oh, pretty fair, as far as our strawberries are concerned. The finest year, doctor, is when you have a first-class crop and your neighbours can only put up rubbish. It's no good every one being in tip-top form. I've got rid of tons, and at no dirt price either." Mr. Carrington's British face beamed slyly above his angelic white mackintosh. It was a face in which stolid satisfaction and stolid woe were easily interchanged, for the heavy lines thereof could be twisted into either expression. Murchison was listening to the hoarse rattle of the clearing shower beating upon a myriad leaves. The gold band in the west was broadening into a canopy of splendour. Had Mr. Carrington been educated up to more pushing and aggressive methods of making money, he would have seen in that sky nothing but a magnificent background for some silhouetted sky sign shouting, "Try our jam." "And these pickers of yours, how long have they been with you?" The lines in the farmer's face rearranged themselves abruptly. "Poor devils, they look on this as a sort of yearly picnic, doctor. There are about 50 of them, and they've been at Goldspur about 10 days." "Many children?" "Children? Plenty. If they were Irish, they'd bring the family pig out, doctor, just to give them some new sort of dirt to wallow in. But then what can you expect? What can you expect?" They had left the park by the western lodge, and came out upon a stretch of undulating fields, closed in the near distance by woods of oak and beech. A tall gabled farmhouse of red brick rose outlined against the sky, with a great fir topping its chimney stacks like the flat clouds seen above a volcano in full eruption. Near it, fronting the road, were a few nondescript cottages, farther still a jumble of barns, outhouses, and stables. In the middle of a 14-acre field Murchison could see 2 zinc-roofed sheds and a couple of old military tents standing isolated in a waste of sodden, dreary soil. Mr. Carrington pointed to them with his whip. "There's the colony. Will you come in first, doctor, and have—" he considered the words and cleared his throat, "and have a cup of tea?" Murchison had noticed the break in the invitation, and had reddened. "No, thanks. We had better walk, I suppose." "Sit light, doctor. We have a sort of road, though it ain't exactly Roman." The farmer passed Murchison the reins, and climbed down, the trap swaying like a small boat anchored in a swell. He opened a gate leading into the field, his white mackintosh flapping about his legs. "Not worth while getting up again," he said laconically. "Drive her on, doctor. I'll follow." Murchison heard the click of the gate and the squelch of Mr. Carrington's boots in the mud, as the trap bumped at a walking pace towards the zinc sheds in the field. The larger of the two resembled a coach-house, and could be closed at one end by 2 swinging doors. The rain was still rattling on the roof as Murchison drove up, and a thin swirl of smoke drifted out sluggishly from the darkness of the interior. The 2 tents had a soaked and slatternly appearance. Empty bottles, old tins, scraps of dirty paper, and miscellaneous rubbish littered the ground. On a line slung between 2 chestnut poles 3 dirty towels were hanging, either to wash or to dry. As the trap stopped at the end of the rough road, Murchison could see that the larger shed was like a big hutch full of live things crowded together. A litter of straw, ankle deep, lay round the walls. A fire burned in the middle of the earth floor. The faces that were lit up by the light from the fire were coarse, quick-eyed, and hungry, the faces seen in London slums. Half a dozen children scuttled out like a litter of young pigs, and stood in the slush and rain, staring at the trap. Murchison's appearance on the scene seemed to arouse no stir of interest among the adult dwellers in the shed. They stared, that was all, 1 or 2 breaking the silence with crude and characteristic brevity. "Hallo, here's the doctor. There's air." Look at the old boss, with a phiz like a round of raw beef stuck on top of a sack of flour." Mr. Carrington arrived with his boots muddy and the lines of his face emphatic and authoritative. "Someone hold the mare. Why don't you keep the kids in out of the wet? This way, doctor, the second tent." Mr. Carrington opened the flap, and letting Murchison enter, contented himself with staring hard at two figures lying on an old flock mattress, with a coat rolled up for a pillow. One was a woman, thin, still pretty, in a hollow-cheeked, hectic way, with a ragged blouse open at the throat, and a couple of sacks covering her. The other was a child, a girl with flaxen hair tossed about a flushed and feverish face. The child seemed asleep, with half an orange sucked to the pulp, clutched by her grimy fingers. Murchison remained for perhaps half an hour in that rain-soaked tent, while Mr. Carrington stumped up and down impatiently, kicking the mud from his boots and eyeing the rubbish that marked the presence of these London poor. The eastern sky was filling fast with the oblivion of night when Murchison emerged. The woman had been able to answer his questions in a dazed and apathetic way. Mr. Carrington met him with a squaring of his sturdy shoulders and a bluff uplift of the chin. "Well, doctor, I'm glad you sent for me." "As bad as that, is it?" "Typhoid, or I'm much mistaken." The farmer thrust his hands into the side pockets of his mackintosh and flapped them to and fro. "Well, I'm damned," was all he said. The cold sky rose dusted with a few stars in the west when the farmer's cart set Murchison down in Lombard Street before his own door. Dinner had been waiting more than an hour. Catherine's face, bright yet a little troubled, met him in the shaded glow of the hall. "You must be soaked to the skin, dear," and she felt his clothes. "No, nothing much. I'm more hungry than wet." "A long case. Dinner is ready." They went into the dining-room together, Murchison's arms about her body. "Some responsibility for me at last," he said quietly. "I believe it is typhoid." "Where? At Goldspur Farm?" "Yes, among Carrington's pickers." "Poor things. They are cooped up like cattle in a shed." He was silent for some minutes, for Mary had set a plateful of hot soup before him, and even doctors are sufficiently human to enjoy food. "There is a child ill," he said, staring at the bowl of roses in the middle of the table. "Poor little thing." "Strange, Kate, but she reminds me wonderfully, very wonderfully, of Gwen." End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of A Woman Swore by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. It was on the second morning following his interview with Dr. Peterson that Parker Steel received two letters heralding the shadow of an approaching storm. "I have laid the facts of the case," wrote the demigod from Mayfair, "before the General Medical Council. I consider this action of mine to partake of the nature of a public duty, for your abuse of your position has been too gross even for medical etiquette to cover. I cannot understand how a practitioner of your reputation could be so mad as to run so scandalous a risk. That you contracted the disease innocently in the pursuit of duty would have won you the sympathy of your fellow practitioners. Your concealment of the disease puts an immoral complexion on the case. Needless to say, I have given Major Murray the full benefit of an honest opinion." Such a letter from a physician of Dr. Peterson's standing would have been sufficient in itself to demoralize a man of more courage and tenacity than Parker Steel. The curt declaration of war that reached him from Major Murray by the very same post exaggerated the effect that the specialist's letter had produced. "Sir, I have received from Dr. Peterson a statement that convicts you of the most scandalous malpraxis. Needless to say, I am placing the matter in the hands of my solicitor. I consider it to be a case deserving of publicity, however repugnant the atmosphere surrounding the affair may be to me and mine. Murray. Those who have touched the realities of war will tell you that they have seen men with faces pinched as by a frost, their teeth chattering like castanets, even under the blaze of an African sun. It was at the breakfast table that Parker Steele read those two ominous letters. The man looked ill and yellow, and his nerves were none too steady, to judge by the way he had gashed himself in shaving. The very clothes he wore seemed to have grown creased and shabby in a week, as though they felt the wearer's figure limp and shrunken, and had lost tone in consequence. It may be remembered that the Immortal three displayed varying symptoms when at grips with death. The tongue of Orthoris waxed feverishly profane. The Yorkshireman broke out into song. Mulvaney the Paddy was incontinently sick. Parker Steele emulated the Irishman in this eccentricity that morning, save that his nausea was inspired by panic, not by heroic rage. Shaken and very miserable, he sat down at the bureau in his consulting room, leaned his head upon his hands, and shivered. For 2 nights he had had but short snatches of sleep, brief lapses into oblivion that had been rendered vain by dreams. The imminent dread of 100 ignominies had held him sick and cold through the short darkness of the summer nights. Dawn had come and found him feverish and very weary. To a coward it is torture to be alone with his own thoughts. The 3rd night he had taken sulphonal, a full dose, and had slept till Symons knocked at his bedroom door. The fog of the drug still clung about his brain as he sat at the bureau and tried to think. He seemed incapable of putting any purpose into motion, like an exhausted battery whose cells have been drained of their electric charge. Parker Steele picked up a pen after he had crouched there silently for some 20 minutes. He opened a drawer, drew out several sheets of note-paper, and began to scribble confused, jerky sentences, to alter, to reconsider, and to erase. The power to determine and to act, even on paper, were lost to him that morning. He wrote 2 letters, only to tear them up and scatter the pieces in the grate, where a lighted match set them burning. He was still on his knees, turning over the charred fragments, when the door-bell rang. The sedate Symons came to announce a patient. "Mrs. Prosser, sir." "Tell her I can't see her." Symons stared. Her master had something of the air of an angry dog. "Tell her I'm busy. She can call again." "Yes, sir." She still stood in the doorway, irresolute, surprised. "What the devil are you waiting there for, Symons?" "Nothing, sir." And she withdrew, with her dignity balanced on the tip of a very much tilted nose. Parker Steele opened the window wide, and leaning his hands on the sill, looked out into the garden. It was air that he needed, air amid the stifling complexities of life that were crowding tumultuous upon his future. The garden, with its sumptuous serenity of its trees and flowers, had no sympathetic touch for him in his agony of isolation. It was his loneliness that weighed upon him heavily at that moment. He had outlawed himself, as it were, from the heart of his own wife. The very house was a pest-house, in which 2 stricken souls were sundered and held apart. If Betty would only see him! If she could only bring herself to understand that he had acted this disastrous part in order to retain the social satisfactions that she loved. Any companionship, even the companionship of a half-estranged wife, seemed preferable to the isolation that he felt deepening about him. He argued that it was his realization of Betty's ambition that had made him dissemble for her sake. Any argument, however suspicious, is pressed into the service of a man whose whole desire is to justify himself. Unfortunately, when a woman's trust has been once shocked from its foundations, No buttressing and underpinning can save that superstructure of sentiment that has taken years to build. Betty had kept to her room, with no one but Madge Ellison to give her sympathy and advice. The husband had always found the friend embarrassing with her presence any rapprochement between him and his wife. As he stood at the open window, with the words of the 2 letters he had read weaving a hopeless tangle of bewilderment in his brain, he heard someone descend the stairs and go out by the front door into the square. Parker Steel realized that this ubiquitous and embarrassing friend had left Betty alone in the room above. There was some chance, at last, of his seeing her alone, and of attempting to break down the barrier of her reserve. He climbed the stairs slowly, and stood listening for several seconds on the landing before turning the handle of his wife's door. The door was locked. Parker Steel frowned over the ineptitude of the manoeuvre. A dramatic entry might at least have given him some dignity to the trick. As it was, he felt like a sneaking boy who had been balked and taken in some none too honourable artifice. "Betty?" "Yes, what is it?" She was in a chair near the window, reading, with her dark hair spread upon her shoulders. Her mouth hardened as she recognized her husband's voice. It was the very day, and she remembered it, the day of Lady Sophia's fashionable bazaar, when Betty Steel had foreseen the people of Roxton at her feet. She had asked Madge Ellison to bring out the dress that she should have worn. Primrose and leaf green, it hung across the footrail of her bed. "I want to speak to you, Betty. Is there anything that we can discuss?" The level tenor of her voice, its unflurried callousness, gave him an impression of obstinate estrangement. "Betty." She did not answer. "Let me in, if you will only give me a chance to justify myself." The very words he chose were the words least calculated to move a woman. Betty, lying back in her chair, pictured to herself a cringing, deprecating figure that could boast none of the passionate forcefulness of manhood. A woman may be won by courage and strength, even in the person of the man who has done her wrong. But let her have the repulsion of contempt, and her instinct towards forgiveness will be frozen into an unbending pride. "I do not wish you to make excuses, Parker." "But, Betty—" "Well?" "It was for the sake of the home, the practice, everything. Can't you understand? Can't you imagine what I have gone through?" Her momentary silence seemed to suggest a sneer. "So you would justify a lie? Betty, don't talk like this. I am worried to death by other matters as it is." "I can understand that perfectly." He began to pace the landing, halting irresolutely from time to time before the locked door. "I have heard from Peterson this morning." No reply. "He is reporting the matter to the General Council, and he has given the truth away to Murray. You know what that must mean." Still no reply. "Betty?" Had he been able to see the cynical smile upon her face, Parker Steel might have understood that, by acting the suppliant for her pity, he only intensified her contempt. "Betty, is this fair to me?" He shook the door with a sudden gust of petulant impatience. "Show me a little consideration. I have some right to demand—" "Demand what you please, Parker, but oblige me by not making so much noise." "You will regret this." His voice was harsh now and beyond control. "I have regretted much already." "Your marriage, I suppose." "There is no need, Parker, to indulge in details." "This is beyond my patience." "And mine, I assure you." He turned and retreated from the attack at the same moment that Madge Ellison reappeared upon the stairs. They passed each other without a word, the woman clear-eyed and uncompromising, the man gliding close to the wall. Madge Ellison found Betty sitting with closed eyes before the open window, the June sunshine dappling the bosoms of the tall trees in the square with gold. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of A Woman Swore by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 40. The month was August, and August at its worst, a month of glare and dust, and an atmosphere more trying to the temper than all the insolent bluster of a braggy March. Mr. Carrington, in his shirt-sleeves and white linen sun-hat crammed down over his eyes, stood under the acacia tree at his garden gate, chatting to the Reverend Peter Burt, curate of Cossington, who had tramped 3 miles to visit some of the sick people on the farm. Mr. Burt was rather a shy little man, very much in earnest, and very much convinced of the responsibility of his position. "All this must have been a great worry to you," said the clergyman, with a comprehensive sweep of an oak stick. "Worry? Don't talk of it, sir. What with the heat, and the medical officer of health, and the sanitary inspector, I've been pretty near crazy. I don't know what I should have done, Mr. Burt, but for Murchison and his good lady." "Mrs. Murchison seems to have been a local Florence Nightingale." Mr. Carrington stared. "I don't happen to know the woman's name," he said, "but she must have been a good 'un, Mr. Burt, to be showed in the same class as the doctor's lady. Why—" and the farmer withdrew his hands from his pockets and tapped his left palm with his right forefinger. "Why, do you know what she did when she'd been over here and seen how we were fixed?" Mr. Carrington paused expressively, and looked the young clergyman in the face, as though defying him to conceive the nature of this unique woman's genius. "No, I have not heard." "Well, Mr. Burt, there's religion and there's religion. Some of us wear black coats on a Sunday and put silver in the plate. Some of us aren't so regular and respectable, but we play the game, and that's more than many of your sitting pew hens do. Excuse me, sir, I'm rather rough in the tongue. Well, Mrs. Murchison, she doesn't strike you as a district visiting sort of lady to look at. She's got a fine face and a head of hair, like the Countess of Camber, who gave the prizes away at our agricultural show last season. Well, Mr. Burt, she came over here and saw what sort of a fix we were in, 2 grumbling nurses and not much more than straw and sacking. Well, what does she do but take one of my wagons and my men and go off to Roxton all on her own." Mr. Carrington paused for breath, took off his sun-hat and wiped his forehead with it, his eyes remaining fixed emphatically on the curate's face. "And what do you think, sir? Back came that wagon of mine, loaded up with linen and basins and crockery, a bed or 2, and God knows what. She'd ransacked her own house, sir, and gone round to all the neighbours begging like a papist. Get the stuff? She did that. Not easy to say no to a woman with a face and a voice like hers. Carmagee joined in, and Canon Stensley, and a good score more. And dang my soul, Mr. Burt, she's been working with her husband here, day in, day out, and that's the sort of thing, sir, that I call religion." The curate began to look vaguely uncomfortable under the farmer's concentrated methods of address. It took much to move Mr. Carrington to words, but when once moved, the result resembled the eruption of a long quiescent volcano, the vigour of the eruption corresponding roughly to the length of the period of quiescence. "I quite agree with you, Mr. Carrington," he said, with a certain boyish stiffness, as though he considered it superfluous for the farmer to condemn his soul to perdition. "You must excuse my language, Mr. Burt. When I get worked up over a subject, I must let fly, and it's these dirty lies that have been flying abroad about this good lady's husband that have made me hot, sir, to see justice done." Mr. Burt appeared interested by the windows of the house that glimmered from amid a mass of creepers, like water shining through the foliage of trees. "One hears very curious rumours," he acknowledged with a discreet frown. "I suppose you've heard them over at Cossington?" "Well, I have heard reports." About our doctor here and the drink. Mr. Burt nodded. But I don't think anyone believed them, he confessed. The farmer's right forefinger began to tap his left palm again. Look here, sir. I ought to know something about Dr. Murchison's character, I imagine. The man's been here nearly a month, living in my house and working like a Trojan. We've had nearly 60 cases, what with the pickers and our own people. You haven't seen what the doctor's been through in this little epidemic of ours, Mr. Burt, and I have. You get to the bottom of a man's nature when he's working 18 hours out of the 24, doing a nurse's jobs as well as his own, and feeding some of the kids with his own hands. I've seen him come into my parlour, sir, at night, and go slap off to sleep on the sofa, he was that done. And never, not on one single blessed occasion, have I seen that man show the white feather or touch a drop of drink. Mr. Burt appeared to become more and more embarrassed by being stared at vehemently in the face, as the farmer's right fist smacked the points of his argument into his left palm. He had to return Mr. Carrington's stare, eye to eye, as a pledge of sincerity. He began to fidget, to scan the horizon, and to fumble with his watch-chain. "Your evidence sounds conclusive," he said. "I think it is time Mr. Carrington ignored the little man's restiveness, and came and stood outside the gate. "Now I make it a rule in life, Mr. Burt, to take people just as I find 'em, and not to listen to what all the old women say. The rule of a practical man, you understand. Now," the curate cast a flurried glance up the road, and pulled out his watch. "You really must excuse me, Mr. Carrington." "In a hurry, are you? Well, I was only going to say that some of us people have come by a shrewd notion how all this chaff got chucked about in these parts. Murchison was a first-class man, and some people got jealous of him and played a low-down game to get him out of the town. You take my meaning, Mr. Burt?" "Yes, certainly. Good heavens, it is nearly 12. I really must say good-bye, Mr. Carrington. I hope—" "One moment, sir. I won't mention any name, but perhaps you are just as wise as I am. And what's more, Mr. Burt, from what I've heard, that gentleman that we know of has just been treated as he tried to treat a better man than himself. It was his wife, they say." "Excuse me, Mr. Carrington, but someone is calling you, I think." "They can wait. Now—" "To be frank with you, Mr. Carrington, I can't." "Oh, well, sir, if you are in such a hurry, I'll postpone my remarks. I was only going to say—" But Mr. Burt gave him a wave of the hand and fled. A girl of 17 came down the path from the house between the standard roses, her black hair already gathered up tentatively at the back of a brown neck, and the smartness of her blouse and collar betraying the fact that she considered herself a mature and very eligible woman. "Dad, are you deaf?" Mr. Carrington turned with the leisurely composure of a father. "What's all this noise about, Nan?" "I've been calling you for 5 minutes. They're all there in the 14-acre. "Who?" "Why, Mrs. Murchison, and the Canon, and old Lady Gillingham, and half a dozen more. Dr. Murchison sent one of the boys over for you." Mr. Carrington began to hustle. "Dang it, I expected them tomorrow." "What a man you are, Dad!" And she stood like an armed angel of scorn in the middle of the path. "You can't go and see them in your shirt sleeves." "Bless my soul, Nan, where's my coat?" "On the fence. You were talking to Mr. Burt long enough to forget it. Why didn't you bring him in?" Mr. Carrington was struggling into his alpaca coat, his daughter watching his contortions with the superior serenity of 17. "Bring who in?" "Mr. Burt. The little man's as shy as a calf." "Perhaps you talked him silly." "Look here, my dear, it's too hot to argue. Is my tie proper?" His daughter regarded him with critical candor. "It will do," she answered resignedly, as though her father's ties were beyond all promise of salvation. The camp of the fruit pickers in Mr. Carrington's 14-acre stood out like a field hospital under the August sun. There were half a dozen white tents pitched near the two sheds, and on an ingenious framework of poles an awning had been spread so that the convalescents could be brought out to lie in the shade and gain the maximum amount of air. The whole place looked trim and clean, and a faint perfume of some coal-tar disinfectant permeated the air. Mr. Carrington, as he emerged from the orchard gate, saw quite a representative gathering moving through the camp. Several of the Roxton celebrities who had subscribed to the relief fund had been invited by Porteous Carmagee, the treasurer, to drive over and see how the money had been spent. The farmer recognized Lady Gillingham's carriage and pair waiting in the roadway beyond the white field gate, and Cannon's landau had drawn up deferentially behind it, while Mrs. Murchison's pony that drew her governess' car was being held by one of the pickers who had lost 2 children but a week ago. Lady Sophia appeared to be holding quite a state inspection, for she had Murchison in his white linen jacket at one elbow, and the Canon in his black coat at the other. She was making considerable use of her lorgnette, a very affable, commonplace, and well-meaning great lady, who felt it to be a most Christian condescension on her part to drive out and examine this temporary hospital and its London poor. Catherine Murchison and Mrs. Stensley were talking to one of the women lying under the awning. The treasurer had remained judiciously in the background, and was snapping away to 3 Roxton ladies who appeared to be fascinated by some subject foreign to enteric fever and pickers of fruit. Porteous Carmagee looked very much amused. A thin little lady in a hat far too big for her, giving her an indistinct resemblance to a mushroom, was attempting to draw more definite information from the lawyer by the feminine pretence of unbelief. "But are you sure, Mr. Carmagee? It may only be a rumour. One hears so many extraordinary things." "I am perfectly sure, madam. There are facts, however, that cannot well be discussed." The suggestion of mystery lent a double glamour to Porteous Carmagee's information. "Then he has left the town for good?" "I think I may swear to that as a fact." "And alone?" "Quite alone." "But surely his wife—" Mr. Carmagee tightened up his mouth and stared reflectively into space. "Don't ask me to unravel the complexities of other people's households, Mrs. Blount." "But how extraordinary! Of course everyone knows that she is ill." "Everyone knows a great deal more of one's private affairs, madam, than one knows oneself." The 3 ladies exchanged glances. They formed 3 spokes of curiosity, with Mr. Carmagee for the hub. "And no one has seen Betty Steele for some weeks." "That is so. And it is rumoured—" "Then you have heard that too?" "What, my dear?" "That it is an affection of the skin." The lawyer extricated himself from the group, and moved to where Catherine's golden head shone Madonna-like over the face of a little child. "Affection of tomcats," quoth he under his breath. "It is curious the way these women play with a piece of scandal like a cat with a mouse. It mustn't die, or half the zest of the game would be gone. Catherine, my friend, you are different from the rest." During these digressions, Mr. Carrington had brought himself within the ken of Lady Gillingham's lorgnette. It appeared to the farmer that the great lady's eyes were fixed critically upon his tie. His right hand blushed as he remembered that there was a 3-inch rent there in the seam of his alpaca coat. Such is the judgment that overtakes those who are mistaken as to dates. "Good morning, Mr. Carrington. We are admiring how beautifully you have managed everything for these poor people. So clean and so airy. I am sure you must have suffered a great deal of inconvenience and worry." Mr. Carrington blushed. Porteous Carmagee, who was watching the drama from a distance, felt for Mr. Carrington a species of ironical pity. The farmer's boots described an angle of 90 degrees with one another, and the vehement smirk upon his face made the redness thereof seem dangerously sultry. "We have all been so interested, Mr. Carrington." "Very good of your ladyship, I'm sure." "I sent you an iron bedstead, you may remember. I hope it has been of use." "Great use, your ladyship." Ah, that is right. And is your family quite well, Mr. Carrington? I hope none of you have contracted the disease. Only my youngest boy, your ladyship, but Dr. Murchison soon had him in hand. Ah, quite so. Good day, Mr. Carrington. And she relieved him from the splendour of her notice, and turned to Murchison, who was waiting at her elbow. What a noble profession, the physician's, Dr. Murchison! The big brown-faced man smiled, and his eyes wandered unconsciously in the direction of his wife. It has its responsibilities, he said, and also its compensations. Lady Sophia waved her lorgnette to and fro, and beamed to the extent of the 5-guinea cheque she had contributed to the relief fund. She was wondering whether it was possible that this quiet, clear-eyed man could ever have been the victim of such a thing as drink. If so, then he was to be pitied and not abused. It must be so gratifying, Dr. Murchison, to save the life of a fellow being. Yes, it is something to be grateful for. How well your wife looks! I hear she has been working here, like any trained nurse. Catherine, dancing a doll before the thin little hands of a child of 4, was serenely oblivious to the great lady's praise. Porteus Carmagee was watching her, smiling, and rattling his keys in his pocket. Your wife is very fond of children, Dr. Murchison. He looked into the distance, and then at the laughing girl of 4. She lost a child, and that means much to a woman. Ah, of course, undoubtedly. Poor little creature. And her ladyship tended benignantly in the direction of the awning. Canon Stensley and Murchison were left alone together by one of the tents. A man was delirious within it, and they could hear the meaningless patter of fever flowing in one monotonous tone. A doctor's life is no sinecure, and he stroked his firm, round chin. No, perhaps no. We walk daily at the edge of a precipice, and yet it has great compensations. They were silent a moment, watching Lady Sophia trying to coquette with a rather overpowered child. You have heard about steel? Yes, my wife told me. One of those strange fatalities we meet with in life, and yet I think there was something of the nature of a judgment in it. Possibly. I am sorry for the woman. Then you are magnanimous. No, I have learned the true values of life. When one has suffered, one loses the meaner impulses. That is so, and remains thankful for what one has. For what one has. And Murchison's eyes were smiling towards his wife. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of A Woman Swore by Warwick Deeping. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. Betty Steele sat alone at the open window of her room one evening as the sun went down over the red roofs of the old town. Lying back in her chair with her head on a cushion of yellow silk, she could see nothing of the life in the square below, but only the tops of the elm trees, the black spire of the church, and an infinite expanse of cloud-barred sky. The west stood one great splendour of scarlet and of gold. Above, at the zenith, the clouds were bathed in a radiance of auriferous rose. A cold chalcedony blue held the eastern arch, where the purple rim of the night merged into the amethystine shadows of the woodland hills. Betty Steele was alone, save for the cat Mignon, curled up asleep in her mistress's lap. Half covering the cat was a crumpled letter, a letter that had been read and re-read by eyes that were blind to the pageant of the summer sky. She stirred now and again in her chair and shivered. The evening seemed cold to her, despite all this chaos of colour, this kindling of the torches of the west. The house, too, had an empty silence, like a lonely house where death had been and set a seal upon its lips. Betty lifted Mignon from her lap, rose, crossed the room, and rang the bell. She took a crimson opera cloak from a wardrobe in the corner, flung it across her shoulders, and returned to her chair, with the crumpled letter still in her hand. "Yes, ma'am." A white cap and apron were framed by the shadows of the landing. Is Miss Ellison back yet, Simons? No, ma'am. She said... Listen, isn't that the front door? Yes, ma'am. Will you ask her to come up to me here? The white cap and apron vanished into the shadows. Betty, lying back in her chair, looked vacantly at the paling sky, with the blood-red cloak deepening the darkness of her hair. The cat Mignon sprang into her lap. Dreamily, and as by habit, she began to stroke the cat, while listening to the murmur of the two voices in the hall below. Brisk footsteps ascended the stairs, with the swish of silk, and the soft sighing of a woman's breath. "Here I am, dear, at last." "Shut the door, Madge." "I missed my train. You must have wondered what had happened." "I have ceased to wonder at anything in life." Madge Ellison looked curiously at Betty lying back in her chair, and crossed the room slowly, unbuttoning her gloves. "You sound rather down, dear. What's that? Have you heard—" Betty Steele's hand closed spasmodically upon the crumpled letter that she held. Her face was hard and reflective in its outlines, and yet in the eyes there was a pathos of unrest, the unrest of a woman whose gods have left her utterly alone. "I have heard from Parker." Madge Ellison threw her gloves on the bed, unpinned her hat, and waited. "He is leaving England." "Leaving England?" "Yes, for the Cape." "And you?" "My own mistress, to do anything that I please." She gave a curious little laugh, and began straightening out the letter on her knee, looking at it with eyes that strove to make cynicism cover the wounded instincts of her womanhood. "Of course, he does not care. He was afraid to face things." "The coward!" Madge Ellison bent over her, and laid one hand along her cheek. "And he has left you here?" "I suppose he thought there was nothing else to do. He says," and she still smoothed the creased letter under her hand, "you have your own money to live on. The practice is worth nothing under the circumstances. I should advise you to let the house. You cannot afford to live in it on £200 a year." "Is that all you have?" "My father left it me." "Wise father." "I never thought, Madge, I should value £200 so much." Mignon, who still possessed some of the kittenish spirit of her youth, rolled over in Betty's lap, and began to clutch at the letter with her paws. There was something pathetic in the way the wife suffered that scrap of paper to be a plaything for her pet. "Then he says nothing, dear?" "Nothing? About your joining him?" Betty's lips curled into a cynical smile. "Why should he?" "But surely—" "It was I who broke the ties between us. I think I hated him. He had so little manliness and strength." Madge Ellison lifted up her face to the fading sky. She was serious for one occasion in her life, a woman touched by the realism of life's tragedies. "Can you never—" "Don't ask me that, Madge." "You'll be well soon, your old self. It is only temporary." "I know." "Then—" "If it were only skin deep. But it is deeper, deep to the heart." The confidante gave a sad shrug of her shapely shoulders. "Don't say that yet," she said. "You might repent it." "You think so?" "I don't know what to think." The sky had darkened. The clouds had cast their cloaks of fire, and in the west one broad band of crimson and of gold held back the banners of the approaching night. From St. Antonia's steeple came the chiming of the hour, slow, solemn tones that filled the silence with mysterious eddies of lingering sound. Madge Ellison was still leaning over Betty's chair, her hands touching her friend's face. "Try not to brood too much on it, dear. I know I am not much of a woman to give advice. You might say that I had no experience." "And I too much. Listen," and she straightened in her chair. "Can't you hear people shouting?" "Shouting?" "As though there were a fire. It seems to come from Castle Gate." They were both silent, listening, and looking towards the open window. Vague, scattered cries rose from the shadowiness of the darkening town. They seemed to be drawing from Castle Gate towards the square. A low flux of sound that rose and fell like the cadence of the sea upon a shore at night. Betty sank back in her chair with a glimmer of impatience on her face. "Of course, I remember." From under the arch of the old gatehouse a crowd of small boys came scattering into the far corner of the square. A number of men followed, lined along a couple of stout ropes. They were dragging a carriage over the grey cobbles and under the dark elms in the direction of Lombard Street. Madge Ellison drew back from the window. Not so Betty. She rose from her chair and stood looking down upon those rough men of the Roxton lanes, who were shouting and waving caps with the unsophisticated and exhilarating zest of children. The carriage, with its plebeian team, passed under Betty's window. In it were a man and a woman, the woman holding a boy upon her knees. Whether some subtle thought-wave passed between those two or not, it happened that Catherine looked up and saw the face at the open window overhead. It seemed to her, in the hurly-burly of this little triumph, that the face above looked down at her out of a gloom of loneliness and humiliation. A sudden cry of womanly pity sounded in her heart. Catherine's arms tightened unconsciously about her boy, and her eyes, that had been smiling, grew thoughtful and very sad. The carriage rounded the corner and disappeared into Lombard Street, with a small crowd of men, women, and children following in its wake. Betty Steele turned from the window with a laugh. "It reminds one of a political demonstration." Madge Ellison had picked up the letter that the wife had left forgotten on the floor. "Shall I shut the window, Betty?" "No, it amuses me. Cela va sans dire." The men at the ropes had trundled the carriage down Lombard Street, and brought to before the great house opposite the cypress trees in Porteus Carmagee's garden. They were very hot and very happy, these Roxton workers, with Mr. William Baines, a stentorian choragus, to the crew. A child threw a bunch of flowers into Catherine's lap. "Hooray! 3 cheers for the doctor! Hooray! Hooray! Hooray!" End of chapter 41. End of A Woman's War by Warwick Deeping. Read by Lynn Thompson.